Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Lovely to have you all here at Love Books tonight, and thank you so much for coming for what I think is going to be a completely fascinating discussion and a great way to kick off our launches for 2025. We're finally getting going quite fast. Thanks, as always, to Jonathan Ball, who are Don's publishers in South Africa, for setting this evening up for us, and of course for helping us with the wine costs. Where would we be without that? Since I've been dipping into the gambling animal over today and yesterday, I found myself very aware of all the risks, big and small, that we humans weigh up every single moment of the day. And in this afternoon, and of course Don's book is about much more serious things than this, but it was, is it going to rain or isn't it? Should we put the wine inside or outside? Should we use the microphones or shouldn't we? Should we put 20 or 30 chairs? If we put 20, are there going to be unhappy people sitting on the steps? Sorry, Gillian. Okay, so let's put 25. Anyway, it's clear that life is risk and we spend a lot of time weighing things up, big and small. Thanks again, Don, for being here tonight. Lovely to have you. Just a little bit about Don before I hand over. He is a professor and head of the School of Society, Politics and Ethics at University College Cork in Ireland. And he's also professor at the School of Economics at UCT, where he was the first dean of a South African commerce faculty to be awarded an A rating by the National Research Foundation. His research unites economic methodology, experimental economics and econometrics, cognitive science, and the philosophy of science. He is also a program director for methodology at the Center for Economic Analysis of Risk at Georgia State University in Atlanta. Lovely having you here. Chatting to Don this evening, it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Nicky Nicholls. Nicky is an associate professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Pretoria, where she teaches post and undergraduate behavioral economics and microeconomics. She's a behavioral economist herself and does experimental research on a range of policy-relevant questions, including bias, corruption, and willingness to contribute to public good. So I think we're in for a fascinating discussion this evening. Thank you so much to both of you.
Thank you, Kate, for hosting this. Thanks, Kate, for hosting this, and thanks to Jonathan Ball for providing wine. That's the really essential ingredient aside from us.
The real reason everyone's here.
So, and thanks to you for all coming, and I hope you find it interesting, and we'll try to make sure we leave some time for questions. I'll just mention, as a teaser right at the outset, it won't be obvious from what's been said about the book so far that there's a lot about elephants in it. And we've been doing experiments with elephants, getting their risk preferences. So that will come up. So if you're interested in hearing about elephants, there'll be plenty of time for that tonight too. Okay, good. So you should be.
Well, excellent. So I guess my first question to Don then is about a comparison between people and elephants, which he draws a lot of in the book. And one of the things that's really interesting, or was really interesting to me, just because I'd never thought of it in those terms, we always talk about how an elephant never forgets and has this incredible memory. So elephants do indeed have very detailed memories, which differ from humans' memories in that we use a lot more imagination. And that has far-reaching consequences. So I don't know, Don, if you want to maybe chat a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, and just in terms of starting with a summary of the really general project of the book, it stems from a puzzle. And, well, two puzzles, actually, but the first key puzzle, two entangled puzzles. The first one is, why is it that we, human beings, have become the ecological apex species? Why is it that we dominate every ecosystem on the planet and every one we move into, and we're the only species that's achieved that? And you might think, well, it's obvious, right? It's because we're smarter. But hang on, what does that mean? What does it mean to say we're smarter? Does it mean we have more brain power? Well, it's not true. Elephants have huge brains, even relative to the size of their huge bodies. Their brains are much bigger than ours. And they're very, very smart, and we are discovering that they have full-blown language. So, and a quite sophisticated one that it takes baby elephants 5 to 7 years to learn. So, it's not, we certainly are smarter in another sense. We're smarter in the sense that we build all this technology and we produce all this art and science, which no other animal does. But that doesn't, it's a mistaken inference to just assume that's because we have lots more brain power. We have built the environment to fit the kind of intelligence we have. And that makes us look a lot smarter because we've manipulated the environment to support our kind of brain. Elephants have not. So that raises the puzzle, right? If elephants are smart enough, and they're not the only, dolphins are very smart, orcas are very smart, African parrots and ravens and crows are super smart. So we're not the only very, very intelligent social species, but we're sure the one that took over the world. How come? That's one of the core issues of the book. And in order to reflect on that, we run a comparison of humans with elephants right through our evolutionary history. And I've been arguing for many years that elephants, that's why we study them, they're the right comparator species for humans. Most of the comparative psychology literature on people and some other species has featured chimps and gorillas. I think they've been way overplayed in that literature. It's obvious why we compare ourselves with them. They're our closest living relatives. And for certain issues, for certain questions, of course, like anatomical issues and so on, they are the right comparison species. But they don't share our environmental history. Elephants do. Elephants involved facing the same climate risks we did around the same time. They grew their big brains as a result of the pressures of that rapidly oscillating early Ice Age climate, just where we did, and they evolved a lot of parallel strategies to us. Now, coming to Nicky's question, what's the core difference? Well, it starts with the brain. Yeah, they have super large, expensive brains, just like we do. And I say expensive because having a brain this size is very, very metabolically demanding. Your brain uses up about 25% of your calorie intake, right, of your whole body. So that is an incredibly expensive organ. And there's no way natural selection builds something like that unless it does you a lot of evolutionary good. It really must have promoted the fitness of our ancestors. Likewise, elephants. With these huge brains, elephants have to eat 80% of the time, and that's just because they've got to fuel that great huge brain. So similarly with them, that big brain obviously is playing a crucial role for them. But here's they have a different structure to their big brain. We have massively overgrown frontal cortex. What that means is that most of your neurons are very distantly connected to anything that directly impinges on the environment, what scientists call a transducer, right? Something that transducts directly perceptual information. Most of your neurons are just processing information about other neurons. And the problem with that is it gives you lots of imaginative power, but it also makes lone humans susceptible to being insane. And if a person were taken out of society and put in a kind of not exactly solitary confinement, the problem with solitary confinement in a prison is the environment is really sparse. But if I took you and dropped you in a complex environment all by yourself, within weeks you would have not be able to distinguish reality from fantasy, right? You'd completely disappear into a crazy land. And that's basically because we just have no means of telling the difference without other people between our fantasies and reality. And that comes from having giant cortex. Elephants, on the other hand, have huge cerebellum. What is that? What they use that cerebellum to do is to use their own history of body movements and body position as an indexing system to have almost seamless recall with almost no decay of everything that ever happened to them. So they use their big brains to have great memory. Now, if you have great memory, you're also going to get really reliable learning. I'll stop and hand back to Nicky. Just let me make one exemplary point, just to give you an example of how these differences play out in life histories, comparative life histories. Suppose you ask the question, well, if elephants are so smart, why did they not develop writing? Which was obviously clearly a big step on our road to civilization. Why did elephants not? Why would they? Why would you? We have to write stuff down because we forget. And we all forget, and we need to keep a record. a shared record in public space that we can all see together to hold ourselves connected to reality. Elephants aren't under no pressure to do that. What use would elephants have with writing? They remember everything. And each elephant remembers. And each elephant remembers what every other elephant remembers, so they don't have this problem.
So I think, yeah, as you read the book, you'll see more and more, as Don's saying now, implications of these differences between people and elephants. But before we talk more about the book, I think what might be interesting to chat a little bit about is what are we talking about when we talk about experimental economics and doing these kinds of, in the book, for example, with people, Don and Glenn talk about how individual people are typically at least moderately risk averse. But despite that, if we look through our evolutionary history, we're seeing very risk-tolerant decision-making at a sort of group level. But I think the question that might come up is, how does one conclude that individuals are risk-averse? So maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, of course, this can get very technical very quickly, so I'll stay, on the surface. But we are, my co-author and I, Glenn Harrison, we are experimental economists mainly, and that means we run experiments in labs with people who come in to be our subjects. And we, in particular, have studied the way people respond to risk. That's our thing. And over the years, we've run these experiments with about 40,000 people all over the world. And we, of course, want a really full sample. So we've run it on all continents with old people and young people and highly educated people and innumerate people and illiterate people and strange populations like refugees in East Timor and fisher people in Ghana and Ethiopian highland shepherds and so on. So we've done a lot of people. And we have a pretty comprehensive picture as a result of how humans respond to risk. And that leads to as Nicky pointed out, the other great puzzle of the book. Individual people are risk averse. That is, they try to avoid even neutral risks. But collectively, we don't look risk averse at all. Elephants, group behavior with respect to risk looks just like individual elephants. They're risk averse at the individual level and at the group level. So the experiments, how do these experiments work? Well, we get a person in the lab and we present her with a whole sequence of pairs of lotteries and ask her to choose. So she'll get a lottery on, and I'll say what a lottery is in a minute. She'll get a lottery on one side and a lottery A on one side, lottery B on the other side, and we say, which lottery do you want to play? Choose. And that lottery is going to be played out for real money. So there's real money at stake, and we try to use generous money. We want people to care about this, right? We want them to be trying to go home feeling good about themselves because they've got some bucks. Yeah. And we give her a lottery in this case, just any situation in which there's two dimensions of variation. There's variation in an outcome magnitude, which might be, in the case of a human, amounts of money. And there's variation in the probability with which you'll get that magnitude. So I might say the A lottery might be a 30% chance of winning $30, and the B lottery might be a 60% chance of winning $80. Sorry, it might be a 15% chance of winning $80, right? Now that's not the only, and we'll give the person at least 40 of those pairs. Minimum 40 to be able to do the math that we need to estimate the risk preference. I prefer a bit more. I prefer to get about 80 to get good estimation power. And that's not the only experiment. That's not enough in itself to estimate a person's risk preferences. You also they have to do some other experiments as well. And I'm going to pass over those because then it just turns into a bit of a lecture if I start laying out why we do the other experiments. But the person does basically 3 experiments. And on the basis of those 3 experiments put together, we can estimate her risk preferences. And we've estimated risk preferences over money and also over health with people. Okay, so elephants. Now, with people, of course, you bring the person into the lab and you explain the lotteries. You say, this is the lottery on this side, that's the lottery on that side. And so they know what they're doing by being instructed. We can't do that with elephants, right? We can't explain to elephants what's supposed to happen. The elephants have to learn the experimental procedure through experience. Fortunately, of course, elephants don't forget anything. So every time they learn a bit, that knowledge is locked in, and they can move on to the next bit. And so our elephants have learned to play lotteries over prizes that are apples and oranges, which for elephants are great rewards because they don't occur in their natural environment, but they sure like them, right? So this beats bark and twigs and leaves. So they're quite happy to play for apples and oranges. We also, one of our concerns, we ultimately want to be able to apply this with wild elephants. Our elephants are tame. We want to apply with wild elephants. They're not in zoos. They're not captive. They're free ranging, but they're tame. They like people. But ultimately, this has to work with wild elephants, so we can't have people around. So one of our considerations also is that the elephants have to work the whole lab themselves. That is, the elephants had to learn to. We of course load the apples and oranges and set up the lotteries, but then the elephants work everything else. So we send a signal that there's an experiment going on. The elephants come. They don't have to come. It's all voluntary participation, as it is with people. But they do come because they want apples and oranges. And we built vending machines, elephant-sized vending machines that vend apples and oranges. And they had to learn how to operate those machines so they can get their rewards. And then we basically give them a sound signal, which varies. One dimension, the length of the signal tells them about the quantity, and the pitch of the signal tells them about the probability. So then we can give them a lottery on one of their vending machines, another lottery on another vending machine. They operate a gate, and they have to choose whether to operate the gate on the right or the gate on the left after they've heard the sound signal. So they have to choose between lottery A and lottery B. And then, because, of course, you must never have somebody work for you and not pay them, the elephants know that after they've played out their lottery and eaten those apples and oranges, the elephant knows to go off where she has another vending machine that is her vending machine, not some other elephant's. They need to know their own vending machine. She goes to her vending and gets paid for her time. She gets her ultimate shop fee regardless. And that also means no elephant ever goes home. If they make a bad choice in their lottery, they don't go home with empty pockets, so to speak. So that's how the elephants do lotteries. And they now fully operate they know exactly how the whole setup works. So we can stand well back and let them go through and do their thing.
Yeah, it's really amazing stuff. Don was telling me earlier, he's been planning these experiments for 20 odd years, hey? Because it takes time to set up relationships with elephants and to learn how to talk to them and how to interact with them and so on. So it's quite an accomplishment. So the book itself, as you'll see when you get to reading it, is very detailed, and it definitely requires a person to invest some concentration in it. But what I really enjoyed about it is that while I learned a lot from reading it, every so often the sense of humor of the two authors comes through. So we read about the bad break that the dinosaurs experienced when they were hit by an asteroid and the tightening of the loincloths of our early ancestors. So I think maybe, Don, I don't know if you want to maybe share a funnier story about your elephants in that vein. I'm sure you've got some light-hearted tales.
Yeah, I could tell a funny story about our elephants. I mean, often people who are involved in conservation and work with animals, they sometimes tend to be a little bit preachy about the animals. I mean, of course we love our elephants, right? And of course we enjoy being with them, but we don't have we're aware of their character flaws too. And one virtue our elephants do not manifest is riveting courage, right? You might think of elephants as these kind of resilient creatures that you think should be, mighty and tough and put up with it. Our elephants are very, very fussy. They don't like wind and they don't like rain. And if it's raining hard or if it's windy, they will not do experiments. They go into the bushes and stay there. Our elephants naturally are afraid of wasps and bees because they have so many nerves in the trunk that it's extremely sensitive. And if they're stung in the trunk, that's a level of pain that's probably well beyond what we experience from a sting. So they're quite afraid of bees. But our elephants have taken this to extreme. They seem to think that every black insect is a bee. So we've had occasions where an elephant sees a fly in the big open experimental area where they wait while they hear their sound signals. And then the elephants will not go into the experimental area until we show them that that fly is gone. And they need a lot of proof that the fly is not there. And then, okay. And then one day, so this is background to one funny story, which was one day we had finished our work for the day, and humans were sitting on the porch of our research area having our G&Ts, and the elephants were not too far away drinking water from the lake. Fortunately, one of the people was close enough to the elephants to be able to see what had happened. Otherwise, we would have just been mystified. But suddenly, the elephants all took off running, panicked, in complete panic. They ran for 1.5 kilometers. The person, it was so, but when the rest of us said, what's going on? The person who'd seen said, a very small fish jumped out of the water close to one of the youngsters, one of the younger elephants, and that elephant panicked and spooked all the other elephants. So evidently they thought it was an ichthyosaurus. And then this is the funniest bit. We watched him run 1.5 kilometers, 6 4-ton animals fleeing from a fish. And we watched them running kilometers. We were looking at them with binocs, and we saw them all stop and have a deliberation, right? Stop and have a little conference on what they thought had happened. And then they took off and ran another 1.5 kilometers, right? So yes, it was an ichthyosaurus. So, yeah.
So excellent memories and maybe a little bit of imagination as well.
Enough imagination to be scared, yeah.
Okay, so I think another thing, obviously the book is about risk. And another thing you talk about quite a bit is ratcheting risks through history. So how once we'd reached some sort of equilibrium about one evolutionary risk that we'd taken, that tended to lead to another more complex form of risk that evolved from there. And I think we've seen that pattern throughout history. So I don't know if you want to maybe talk a little bit around that.
Yeah, the book, well, we try to keep it interesting and even sometimes lighthearted. At some points, it does not end nice. It does not end on a happy note. Because the book incorporates basically a history of human collective risk management going through our deep evolutionary past, starting before we were civilized Homo sapiens. When one stands back and looks at the evolutionary milestones in human history, one can see that they can all be represented as the collective solution to a little battery of risk problems. And we always deal with these risk problems by doing just what a sensible, collectively, by doing just what a sensible financial advisor would do, building a portfolio, right? So you have some risk, you want to manage that risk. What do? You widen the context in which the risk occurs so you can find a way to offset that risk with something else. This drives ever-increasing complexity. And it creates what we call a risk ratchet. It means every time we solve a risk problem, we create a new and more complex risk problem on a bigger scale. And then we do it again. And then we do it again. And we basically tell in 2 chapters the history, a high-level history of humanity in terms of that ratchet. Well, now consider where we are now. We now, as a species, face a totally generalized problem, risk problem, 2 dire problems, climate change and biodiversity collapse, which are faced by everyone on Earth. So it's, we don't have the advantage that, well, somebody's got a terrible risk problem over there, but not us. Right? It's everybody. And furthermore, it's at planetary scale. So we can't, there's no mechanism by which we can follow our past strategy of sticking it inside a wider portfolio. We've reached the limits of what we can bundle. But we've never really coped with risk any other way. Collectively, we're great risk managers, but we're terrible long-term planners. We just don't do it. It's not that we try to long-term plan and fail. Basically, humans at population scale don't long-term plan. They just don't. So we're in trouble. And you might think, as Elon Musk seems to, that, oh, we should do the portfolio thing again by going to another planet. The problem with that is that the other planets we could go to aren't improvements on the Earth we're wrecking, right? So yes, maybe we could live on Mars under a bubble, but consider what our actual problem is on this Earth. It's that, well, by no later than 2050, most of Africa will be uninhabitably hot. People will not be able to live in most of Africa, right? It'll be too hot and their brains will boil. They'll have strokes. So, all right. What then hardly seems like, if the problem is that Africa is uninhabitable, it hardly seems a solution to go somewhere even less habitable, like Mars. Right? If we could live on if the solution is to live under a bubble on Mars, well, then why not live under a bubble in Africa? Right? So that is just the idea that we can leave the Earth. We can do still run our old ratchet by becoming a space traveling species. Just seems like a schoolboy's fantasy. I can't mention Elon Musk and schoolboy in the same breath without mentioning at the risk of my own embarrassment, my wife, who grew up in Pretoria, babysat Elon Musk and knows him only in nappies. And so when I reflect, I realize the problems she could have solved if she could have, she had a bathtub and a baby, right?
Yes, so Elon, yes, he's also another nice illustration of the human imagination and the way it can get disconnected from reality, is he not? So I think another interesting theme in the book is talking about how social risk management approaches had led to the development of different norms in society. I think one of the stories you tell is how sexism might have originated from social risk management approaches. So I don't know if there's an illustration there that you'd like to.
Sure. So we identified there were a few key tools that humans had to develop in order to be able to do this collective risk management thing. One of those key things was long distance trade, which is very, very ancient. So that goes right, but it precedes civilization. It doesn't follow from civilization. It's one of the building blocks. But another building block was a normative system that leads us to try to expand the limits of normative communities. So the morality that a hunter-gatherer tribe applies within itself to its own members, we see starting about 50,000 years ago, and we see it first evolving down here on the southern coast of Africa, we see people starting to apply their internal norms to strangers, and so be able to increase the size and scale of their communities, which is crucial to be able to run that risk management ratchet. And by the way, the trigger for that, a crucial trigger for that, is the very first human businesses was firekeeping, right? Once we had to cook our food, we had the problem that we needed to have a fire going. Starting and maintaining fires is not easy, right? And you need proper kindling. You can't do it just anywhere, and you can't do it in the rain, right? But it was crucial. Petrol for emergencies. And there were, no matches and no petrol, right? And there's lots of anthropological and archaeological evidence that the response to that was that some people set up, specialized as fire maintainers and firekeepers. And those are the first human businesses. So I want to cook my supper. I go to the fire station where there's always a fire going, and those people just keep the fire going all the time, probably in a cave or under a rock or under some overhang so they can keep the fire going in the rain. And I use their fire and give them some of my meat or some of what I've hunted or gathered, right? And there's also quite a lot of evidence that if you're once you're a firekeeping operation, well, now you're sitting around maintaining the fire, but your hands are free. You're not hunting and gathering. You might as well not waste that time. Why don't you sow some pelts? And why don't you start selling pelts to the people coming to buy fire? and so on. Now notice if you are running, this is so the general store is one of the foundations of civilization, not something civilization gets to later. And once you have people running these businesses, they have an incentive nobody else has to try and expand the sphere of morality, right? Because I want to serve multiple tribes. I want to serve multiple hunter-gatherer groups, not just one. That's probably not a sustainable business. I also don't want every time a customer from one group is at my place and customers from the other group come, I've got a war on my hands, right? So it's in my interest to try to find ways of getting them, helping them get along, which I can do by encouraging wide norms that have wider reach. As always, with evolution, as Nicky pointed, these things are multiple-edged. There's usually an upside and a downside to these kinds of things. Of course, as we expand our normative communities, we also expand the scale of our wars, right? Instead of small battles between small hunter-gatherer groups, you get huge battles between big nation-state level size things, which is a lot worse. But also, we discussed some work which actually is we owe to a brilliant young economist named Caelan O'Connor on the origins, the very, very deep origins of sexism and racism, which come from the fact that that's the mechanism by which we expand norms. Notice the normative structures rest on a foundation of division of labor, right? It's once the fire keepers specialize and the pelt makers specialize, and we start getting long distance trade based on that specialization, that's where we get the incentives for the normative widening. But now we're going to get much higher levels of specialization of labor within the community than hunter-gatherers aren't actually specialized. The picture of the men going off hunting all the time while the women do the gathering isn't really. It does describe some hunter-gatherer communities, but women did a lot of hunting and men did a lot of gathering. And that's true in many modern hunter-gatherer communities too. However, as businesses start to get more complex, humans have an ever greater need for some kind of marker to help decide who does what. And they'll just seize on whatever distinctions are already there, right? They'll seize on a distinction that's already there and say, you do this and you others do that. And one obvious marker is sex, right? There's an obvious marker with some of the people are men and some of the people are women. And so labor will tend to get divided. We see this in every human community. We see it's not always the same division of labor. It doesn't even always favor men. But we see division of labor that correlates with sex in every human community. Now here's the problem. Wherever you divide the labor, the returns to that labor are unlikely to be identical. If there's a correlation between sex differences and division of labor, you're going to get different returns to the sexes. That is, you're going to get different returns on the investment of their time and energy. Well, from that, what would you expect? You'd expect to find a mix. You'd expect to find that most human communities seem to be sexist, but some of them would be pro-male sexist and some would be pro-female sexist. Because I haven't said anything yet about why it's the women who keep getting the short end of the stick when the labor is divided. Yeah. But of course, there is one major difference between men and women, which is that women are preoccupied with children, and men are not. So men just have more time on their hands. And that advantage of extra time, and also men can be out in public, as it were, all the time, whereas women are spending quite a bit of time not out in public because they're minding they're feeding and caring for the children. That little advantage will tend to then tip the correlation between the sex roles and the returns on investments of time and energy persistently in favor of men. And then because what humans do is take all their whatever practices they have and moralize them, that is, turn them into norms. We don't just have men doing stuff for higher return and women doing other stuff for lower return, but we moralize it and say that's how it should be, right? And anybody who wants to change that status quo is putting our risk management strategy at risk. Again, that's Kaelin's work, not mine.
But it's just one example of the way Don and Glenn sort of weave this story together. And I think just hearing all the background that goes into that story tells you something about how this book is set up. I mean, it's telling a story over many millennia, somehow in less than 400 pages. But it's just a fascinating treatment of our very lengthy history, taking this idea of risk and weaving it in throughout and telling kind of how we got to where we are today, and disturbingly how the book starts and ends with climate change, right? I mean, we start off by talking about how back in the day it was a response to extreme or varied climatic conditions that led to the brain development that Don talked about at the beginning, and the fact that we have these very demanding, expensive brains. And now, once again, it's climate change that potentially leads us to catastrophe.
Yeah.
But maybe before we get too tied up in this, we promised faithfully to leave some question time.
Let me just add one more thing. There's a little treat in the middle of the book, which is we have a little science fiction interval, where we imagine that elephants instead of humans had developed civilization. And we have a few pages narrated by some elephant anthropologists. So these are scientists who study people. And they're trying to explain why they are the apex species and why they're doing the opposite of our project. They're wondering why humans, with all their skills and talent, are not the apex species, right? What went wrong for humans? Why are elephants the dominant species on Earth? And of course, they light on the fact that we're crazy, right? They say, yeah, they're very, very clever, but they're insane, right? They can't tell fantasy from reality.
And we're seeing it more and more in reality, right?
This also relates to the point I made about sexist norms. We, of course, have the elephants describe a little bit their social structure.
I did enjoy that, with the men being kept in special places.
We imagine that elephant civilization is incredibly oppressively sexist in favor of the females, right? Because in elephant society, males do not hang around with the main matriarchal herd and the babies. Furthermore, the senior matriarchs regulate the mating opportunities of the males. The male elephant doesn't just mate with whoever he feels like. He mates with who the women decide he will mate with. And male elephants generally don't have offspring until they're about 40, because they have to learn how to conduct themselves in female society, and they have to be acceptable. And here's I'll leave you with this nice fact about elephants. There are some male elephants, who manage to make babies when they're only 25, 26, 27. Nobody does it much below that, but there are a few. Mostly you got to be 40 before, but some in their 20s and 30s. Is there some special behavior we see in those guys? Yes. Most male elephants, after they leave the matriarchal herd and form bachelor herds, periodically go and visit their mothers. And those are not the herds from which they draw mates, for obvious reasons, right? Mom's herd is not where you go to make babies. So, well, it turns out there's a correlation between how often a male elephant spends visiting his mother and how soon he's judged an acceptable mate by matriarchal herds. Yeah?
That is the lesson I'm going to take home to my son.
So,
I think we've got a question already over there.
Thanks, you're a great storyteller. I've got two questions. I just want really short answers. The co-writer,
Who is he? What is his role? And also, what was the impetus? She mentioned that you've been working with elephants for like 20 years or something. What was the starting point? What was the thing that got you to that?
Great, thanks. So, the co-author first. Yes, thank you for asking about the co-author. He needs to be acknowledged. Glenn Harrison and I have been, we met, let's see, in 1988. When I was a PhD student and I took a course in international trade economics, and my lecturer was Glenn Harrison. And I also ran the bar at the university, and all the economists
and Glenn
drank.
frequented the bar.
Yeah, all the economists drank at the bar a lot, and so I got to know Glenn very well. Mostly, after I took his course, I got to know him as a friend in my bar, and we've worked together ever since. And we had a life-changing development in 2010, without which this elephant work would not be happening, which is that we secured an endowment, that is a one-time award of money that was big enough that we can fund our research off the interest on that principle. So we don't have to apply for grants. Most academics spend 50 to 60% of their research time writing grant proposals.
I can vouch for that.
So this is fantastic, and that allows us to do big, ambitious projects like this elephant thing. It's a 15-year project, the elephant work. You can't, if you try applying, you can't get 15-year grants, right? And no one will give you a grant to do the first 3 years of a 15-year project, because the risk that you won't get funding for the next 3 years is too high, right? So nobody would be able to get a grant to do what we're doing. So Glenn and that endowment funds a center, which is the Center for the Economic Analysis of Risk, and of course our endowment has a mission associated with it, which was to establish a global risk research lab, that is a risk research lab with outposts in multiple continents. And our busiest lab is at Cape Town, at UCT. And then we also have labs in Denmark and Holland, and of course the headquarters lab in Atlanta. And Glenn is the overall director of that, the executive director of that global lab. And I'm also a director, but Glenn is the boss. But I ran the whole South African operation. And ultimately, the reason I spend now much of my time in Ireland and took a post there was because trying to run the global research lab from here, from Cape Town, was just putting me on airplanes way too many hours of the year. So I just wanted to live more centrally, but I come home a lot.
Before you answer the second question, can I just say that one of the first times I met Glenn, I was told about him that one of the distinctions that he holds is that he's one of very few people who've played quite high-level Aussie rules football and published in top 5 economics journals.
Yes,
So,
he was in fact
he's a very interesting character.
He was in fact a professional Aussie rules football player. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So he's a lot bigger than me. He's a lot bigger than me. Yeah. The origins of the elephant work, that was your second question? Yeah. I should mention here, my motivations initially 20 years ago was just, I knew that sooner or later we'd want to look at another species, and I wanted it to be the right species. And for reasons I've explained briefly, I didn't therefore want to work with primates, with monkeys and chimps. And I thought, an equally right species in some ways might have been dolphins or orcas, but they didn't co-evolve with us. They evolved under very different circumstances, and they're just really hard to work with because you've got to be in the water. So I had this. And I always really liked elephants. I don't consider any minute spent with elephants a wasted minute. But there's also a serious conservation policy mission with which our work is associated. For wild elephants to be sustainable, many thousands of them are going to have to move large distances. We've got over-concentrations of elephants in some places and no elephants in other places. So to have sustainable overall population, a bigger population that is also sustainable, they've got to move. Quite a lot of elephants have to move. Now, how will we get thousands of elephants to move? You can't chase them or scare them or put them in lorries, right? The only way to move thousands of elephants is the same way you would move thousands of people. just by giving them a good offer, by persuading them that over there is better than where you are here. And by trying to develop this two-way communication about risk and with elephants, this two-way economic exchange system, the idea is that we could use those same signals. So here's the basic idea. Suppose we want a few hundred elephants to go from KwaZulu-Natal to Zambia. So they're going to have many, many days of travel. Morning one, they wake up. And we use, by the way, we don't have to teach every elephant the meaning of the little language of the signaling system. Only the matriarchs need to know, because they'll explain it to the others. Right? So, sort of. So on day one, the elephants get a choice between a place A they could go, where we will have we'll have provided an Easter egg hunt, as it were, with goodies, or place B, where there'll be an alternative. That's their other lottery. Notice, you've got to give them a choice. We can't just lead them along, come follow the bouncing orange, because elephant social structure is entirely based on the matriarch's track record in making good decisions. Right? That's what makes her the matriarch. So if they don't have good decisions to make, their social structure collapses. They can't assess each other anymore. They don't know who counts as better and worse. So you have to give them choices. So choice between, imagine over here is A, that would be okay by us. Over there, B, that would be okay by us. In between, maybe is Mrs. Mkhizi's watermelon patch. We don't want you going there, right? So we tell them, that's really risky, right? Go to Mrs. Mkhizi's watermelon patch and someone may shoot you, right? That, in other words, very high risk. Avoid that. So that's the idea. And then day two, right? Wherever they got to on day one, they get another pair of choices. So you can see that you'd have to map between KwaZulu-Natal and your destination. You'd have to have a branching map that ensured that that by whatever exact path they chose to follow, they'd ultimately wind up where you want them to be. So that's the policy objective of the research, as opposed to just satisfying our curiosity and learning more about ourselves by having another species with which to compare ourselves.
Question. When you said you spoke to different human population, I can see how you would speak to an American, an Englishman, you would say money, whatever. But if now you go to a fisherman somewhere in Africa or in Asia, how can you communicate what you want? How do they get this country system?
That's a great question. I mean, of course, the language part is only the beginning. Obviously, we get local informants to speak to the people in their language, but that's not so hard. But that points to a much deeper problem. I'll just give you one example. The Ethiopian Highlanders none of them read, and so they do math, but they don't do it by manipulating symbols the way we do it. But here they are being faced with tasks which involve descriptions of probabilities and amounts of money, which of course normally we present as graphics. So yeah, where for all such populations, we have to do a lot of tricky thinking about how to get the idea across with some kind of visual representation, so that we don't depend on writing, or so that we don't depend on written arithmetic. We always get our populations, before they do the real experiment, they do some trials for money. I mean, you always want people to have some stake in what they're doing. You never want to ask people to do something for free. But they'll go through some trial where they're just learning, where all they're doing is seeing what happens in terms of outcomes when they go through the choice procedure. And I'm pretty proud of some of the ways we've thought of managing to display the ideas just using visual information, just using colors and proportional sizes, and so that we don't have to rely on writing. And we don't assume we don't assume that one kind of solution works for anybody who's not a Western educated person, right? We look at each culture specifically and see what new solution do they need. I mean, that's sort of mostly behind us. We're not really doing that anymore. We're preoccupied with elephants now, but we did do that. Here and then right in front. Nicky, I might be biased.
I was going with, yeah, exactly.
Okay, I might be biased because of where I'm sitting.
In fact, the gentleman was first.
Okay.
So
Just in terms of human tendency to take risks and where it got us to at this point.
Yeah.
What do you think the effects of artificial intelligence are?
Yeah. So let me say, artificial intelligence. I know a bit about it. My PhD was in artificial intelligence, which I earned in 1990. And I was in fact working on what were then called so-called connectionist models. Those were the theoretical ancestors of the current deep learning models, the LLMs, like ChatGPT and so on. So if I'd stuck with it, I guess I would be much richer.
but then you wouldn't have written this book.
Then I wouldn't have written this book. But anyway, that was what and that theory's been around. The theory we had going in the late 80s is pretty much the same theory that's being applied now. The problem was the theory had run way ahead of the engineering. Right? So we had the theory, but we couldn't build systems at any kind of scale. But so I say all that only to emphasize that I know quite a lot about how these systems work. And they are going to change the world very, very, very dramatically. One of the things that is, of course, they develop themselves, right? So you get much faster evolution of the quality of the product because each generation AI contributes to building and designing the next generation AI, right? The process becomes kind of the technological ratchet becomes self-managing. ChatGPT is a piker compared to what's going to be on the market by the end of this year. I can tell the difference between ChatGPT output and human output, but I can't tell the difference. Well, nobody can tell the difference between the OpenAI O3 system, which is now in beta testing and will be on the market later in 2025 or early 2026 at the latest. That, just to give you one example of how revolutionary an effect this is going to have. Think of the value, the dollar value, the rand value, of all the hours that people all over the world have put into learning how to write computer code. Think of how valuable a skill that has been up until like just now. What is going to be the value of writing computer code next year? 0. Right? O3 can write much better code, much faster in any programming language than any human being. So coding is just not going to be something humans do. Right? It would make no more sense for humans to code than for humans to try to generate their own electricity with their bodies, which we once did. So, right. So, that's the biggest wipeout. If we think of that human capital, and that's why I say put a rand value on it, that will be the biggest, fastest wipeout of capital ever, well exceeding the capital that was wiped out in the first 3 years of the Great Depression. My own view, policy-wise, it's not that AI is going to take away our jobs. AI will massively increase our human productivity. So there will be a whole new bunch of things for people to do that nobody has thought of doing before. However, it's going to so accelerate the pace of change in labor markets and in skills markets that nobody's going to be at this model in which you do get most of your education early on and then work is going to be impossible. So people are going to find their income streams very, very volatile. There's going to be periods in which they're in the right place at the right time, and then suddenly the circumstances will change and they're in the wrong place at the wrong time. And they've got to go back to school and learn some new stuff. And this happening on an accelerating cycle through everybody's life. Well, I think that's probably not something humans can stand. I think we're seeing the social stresses of the fact that humans can't even cope with very well with the pace of change that basic industrialization brought, never mind this mania. Therefore, we are going to have a fairly generous universal basic income, right? People are going to have a reliable stream of income that they get no matter what, or we just won't be able to socially cope. UBI is simply going to be an essential precondition for stable human society. Without it, we'll have chaos and anarchy. Yeah.
It's going to need a little bit more than the SRD at the moment of $350 a month as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you were mentioning how, obviously with climate change, we're the only species that knowingly is leading to our own destruction. And you mentioned how part of the problem is that our brains aren't able to, well, collectively we're not good long-term planners. Does that mean we're basically, by our biology, doomed to a specific outcome? Or what is the message that you would give to, say, climate scientists about how we can work with that biology to still shift behaviors?
Great question. Let me just say a few. I'll make several different bits of answer to it. So just a correction on one point. You started by saying we're the only species that might bring about our own destruction. That's not really true. A lot of animals went extinct because they went about disastrous and hopeless life history plans. They just got stuck in bad ideas. I mean, pandas are a bad idea, right? Pandas are a bad idea because eating one thing is a bad idea, right? And pandas will go naturally extinct, except they won't go extinct because we will keep them alive because we think they're so cute. So pandas had another strategic idea up their sleeve, right? Being really cute to humans, that is going to get them out of the disaster that they got into by eating only bamboo. But so lots of animals are extinct because they had bad ideas. But to get to the rest of your question, where we are now in our prospects. You phrased it nicely when you said, were we always on an inevitable course to destruction? And some of the way my description of this risk ratchet, which we just keep scale up until eventually we can't scale it up anymore, kind of looks that way, right? It looks like there's this sort of inevitable, we're on a path to doom from the outset. Now, maybe that's right. There has been a research enterprise for many, many, many years, since the early years after World War II, of searching the skies for intelligent life. Yeah. The SETI project. And of course, none has been found. No traces of intelligence elsewhere in this gigantic universe have so far been detected. And one possible explanation of that is that high intelligence tends to extinguish itself. That high intelligence, because it's extremely energy consuming, tends to burn out its environment. So the reason we don't find any intelligent aliens, suppose intelligence arises regularly in the universe, but the intelligent species don't last any longer than us. Then the chance that any two of them exist at the same time can become quite small, right? You can have millions and millions and millions of occurrences of intelligence, but if every time intelligence occurs, it snuffs out because it's unstable, then the chances that any two intelligent animals are co-occur in the universe becomes very small. So every intelligent species thinks it's alone. That's one possibility. We do some assessment in the last chapter of the book on what the stakes really are here from climate change and biodiversity collapse. We give arguments for why we think the actual extinction of people is very unlikely. Right? It's not at all likely. We are highly adaptive. And there are going to be places in the world which will remain habitable. Remember, one crucial saving grace here is, if civilization collapses, we stop heating the planet at that point. Now, civilization collapse doesn't mean everybody dies. It just means a lot of people die, but it doesn't mean everybody dies. And there will be still habitable parts of the earth with people inhabiting them, and people are very adaptive and resourceful, and so will those people be. The worry, of course, is, given that we seem to know only one way of collectively managing risk, those surviving people who now innovate new ways of coping in this much hotter, more volatile planet they live in, basically find some new way of creating another disaster, right? Just start the whole ratchet up again, right? But of course, any two runs of a complex process like that won't be the same. So it might be another ratchet, but it'll have different details. It'll have a different history. I don't know, should you be depressed by that? Should we be depressed by that? I mean, didn't we always know that this extraordinarily complex lifestyle, set of lifestyles, bundle of lifestyles that humans have developed? Surely we always knew it's kind of precarious and a wild adventure. Right? It is a wild adventure, and it's in the nature of wild adventures that lots of bad stuff happens along with good stuff. And those people who survive civilization collapse will have love stories and art and great ideas. So I think civilizational collapse, the collapse of the civilization we have now, is relatively likely. But I think that's, okay. It's not, it doesn't fill me with dread. Last point, though. Where climate change, I am not at all implying that we should just complacently sit back and let the climate get warm. That's madness. We're not going to keep average global temperature rise under 2 degrees. That's now a lost target. It's not achievable. But it matters a lot if we can hold it to 3 rather than 4. It matters a lot if we can hold it to 4 rather than 5, right? We must not get obsessed about these artificial ceilings we raise and then crash through, right? The less fossil fuel we burn, the better. However, we argue in the last chapter of the book, we should not expect there to be one magic general policy for everybody to adopt that will solve the whole problem on a global scale. This scale of problem is not soluble. What we should expect to happen rather is lots of local responses by different groups of people and different human institutions to different aspects of the problem. And some of those will work and some of them won't. Over time, because some will work and some of the ones that work will get copied, the rate of fossil fuel emission will likely continue to decline. Furthermore, the population is peaking, right? We already have clear demographic, and that's mainly because more women are getting educated, right? The predictor of population stabilization is women getting educated. We have the clear signs all over the world, everywhere. We're going to peak at about 10 billion. We're around just 8 billion or so now. We're going to peak at 10. And then the human population is going to shrink. That's baked into the demographics now. That is, those new people, those new 2 billion people, their grandmothers are already alive. So we know they're coming. But we also know beyond that there'll be fewer. So that will also reduce the stress. Well, so maybe we hold the global warming to 4 degrees. Maybe we hold it. That's pretty cataclysmic. That means most of Africa is uninhabitable. That means Australia is uninhabitable. That means the city of Cork, where I live, is underwater. So it's pretty bad. But it's not, civilization might not even collapse at 4 degrees, maybe.
So I think there was one question back there, and I make it a happy one.
Yes, thank you. My original question started from wondering about the experiments with elephants and wondering
to what extent do you need for them to trust you to take these experiments seriously, and how that trust is built? But as I've been pondering this question, I've been then thinking about the relationship between trust and risk-taking, or mistrust and what you were calling risk-racketing. And maybe you can just comment on that more broadly, but I'm thinking here of trust within species, within human societies, and a massive breakdown of trust, or as we talk about it in the kind of contemporary moment.
Sure.
So kind of philosophically the relationship between those two things, but also as this is playing out in relation to the big questions you're grappling with.
Right. So quickly on the elephants, and then I'll get to where the elephants trust us because all their experience says they should. And we're therefore very, very careful never to misrepresent anything to them. So we would never give them a sound signal that isn't true, right? If we say this is the number of orange, there's 4 oranges with a probability of 0.3. Well, then, we ran a real randomization that gave a 0.3 chance of 4 oranges, right? So it's true what we told the elephants. And we never, ever tell them anything that isn't true. And they learn really fast. So, one of the things they've learned is, this is accurate information. We can believe it. With respect to trust, the current trust problem, which indeed is acute and terrible, I stressed earlier that what has allowed us to cope with our insanity problem has been use of publicly accessible, stored information in the environment, right? So I would be crazy if I was relying on my own brain. You would be crazy if you were relying on your own brain. He would be crazy if he was relying on his own brain. But we can all agree on the meanings of some stuff. We can all write things down about what we all think is true. We can all see that common representation. And we can all use that as an anchor to keep ourselves connected to reality. That is think of that as the fundamental killer app of human ecological dominance. Right? Writing is crucial to civilization. Now that doesn't mean no one was civilized till they wrote. Right? There were people in Africa 50,000 years ago didn't have writing yet, but they did actually have external storage of information because they did practice long distance trade and they had money. And you can actually use money to represent other things. So they weren't writing yet, but they were externally storing information. And now, I also stressed that another key part of the civilizing toolkit was this extension of norms. And trust is based on norms. Trust is based on shared norms, shared expectations about what people will and won't do, or should and shouldn't do, and will and won't expect other people to do in different situations, which can be good or bad. Again, sexist norms are norms, and they're bad norms. Racist norms are norms, they're bad norms. And then, of course, there are many good norms. Like, be kind to people in distress, which most people are. What's wrong now? Notice, with the internet, and social media in particular, we've hacked that basic tool. Because the internet creates a scenario in which we are no longer putting shared representations of what's true in a public space we can all see, right? We're creating little tiny information micro communities full of people with an insanity problem, because we all have a potential insanity problem. And what do? They make themselves collectively insane, right? I mean, I think the political situation in the United States as we speak is now a society that is become culturally psychotic. And what does the psychosis what's the root of the psychosis? Not that they're crueler than most people or dumber than most people. It's that they have very, very, very large numbers of them have almost no significant, important, true beliefs about society. Right? Almost very large proportions have almost no true beliefs about how society actually works. Well, so sure enough, it's a gigantic mess. And what got them there? Social media is what got them there. And we're all at risk. They're not the only ones who had social media. Yeah.
I don't know
Sorry.
who was first.
Yeah.
There were two.
The question is possibly a bit left of center. Why Mars and not the moon?
Yeah.
Which is right next door.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, well, crazy humans, right? I mean, so the Chinese.
I mean, the moon is right next door.
Yes, I agree. Why not the moon? I don't know why Elon. Mars is much larger. It may have water. It might have some water, maybe.
Maybe it was the bedtime stories in the
Yeah. It also, because I think for Elon Musk, the moon's already been done, right? So that would bore him. People have already landed there. Also, it's quite clear the Chinese have decided they're going to build a moon colony now. In fact, the Chinese are, I said Americans are not the only psychotic people, and the Chinese are now claiming the moon is part of China because,
That is
yeah.
the issue. I think
Uh,
territorial.
yeah. And so Musk wants to go one step beyond that. While the Chinese are fooling around with the moon, he'll go to Mars.
It's a diversion tactic.
Sorry?
It's a diversion.
I think he really does want to found a civilization. I think he really does want to found a civilization on Mars. Because it would flatter his vanity, I think. Yeah. And he's convinced it would somehow be good for the rest of us.
Takes bad drugs on occasion, like when you change the beautiful blue bird of Twitter to X, that night you got a bad bank for his dealer.
This is a plausible explanation.
Apologies for any offense of.
Well, think about what it's like. If your main strategy for avoiding insanity is sharing information with others, what happens if you're the richest person in the world and you come to the conclusion on the basis of that the only useful information is your own?
Yeah.
And nobody else has anything to tell you of any value.
It's only virtually the richest person. All the
Well, yeah.
no cash impossible. Like
Yeah.
Virtual.
Well, of course, all my money's virtual too. But I still feel okay. I'll be able to pay for my hotel room tonight.
You hope.
Yeah.
All right, I think the next question was over there and then in the front.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I hope my question will provide an opportunity for a silver lining. So
Please, that would be nice.
Curious, I'm very interested in artificial intelligence and also the intelligence of other species beyond just humans.
Yeah.
And with the extensive work you've done with elephants, to see that range of intelligence, which is basically very distinct from humans, as you described in orcas and dolphins and even in octopus.
Yeah.
So when you think about the future and the progress we are making with artificial intelligence and algorithms significantly being defined by human intelligence, now hypothetically speaking, I don't know if the book answers this in any way or you have your personal thoughts on this. What do you think of a future where we are able to incorporate the intelligence of other species? Do you think it will possibly provide a neutral architect for the future as against an intelligence that is very biased to a particular species?
So that's the subject of the book I'm writing now with a different co-author, Ross Harvey, and it's about a more radical vision for conservation, in which we argue that the goal of conservation shouldn't be for us to manage all the other species, but to figure out how we can co-manage the earth with them by sharing information with them in the way we've shared it with other humans, right? That was our basic trick, right? Sharing information in certain ways with each other. Well, can we apply that trick across the species line? Of course, that is something we're trying to do with the elephants. And yes, AI could play a huge role. One of the futures I have a feeling could befall our experiment. Remember, one aspect of our experiment is to share information with the elephants about risk, yeah? And we're using these little signaling mechanisms to do it. And I fear that in about 3 years' time, we're going to look like the people who were building a Model T Ford in the garage, while down the street somebody else was building the Concorde. Because the AI people, we're going to sort of walk out into the sun. Here we are. We can use a little signaling system to tell elephants about probabilities. And they'll say, well, we're having conversations with the elephants about Art Deco. Right? Because because we used AI to decode their rumbles, and now we're having conversations. I think that, yes, we will be having conversations with other animals within a very short time because of the very, very rapid progress of these AI systems, these deep learning systems. I think the dolphin people are going to beat the elephant people to it because the dolphin people are ahead, right? They've been doing conversation work and conversation modeling with dolphins for longer, and they've got a bigger database. So I think they're going to get there first. But I think the first conversation, true conversation between a human and another animal will be between some humans and dolphins. That said, and then we of course have their resources to bring to bear on common problems. As you say, exactly. They're smart. Let's bring now one worry I do have. The moment we can converse with another species, we can lie to that other species. And I'm not seeing any significant efforts to think about how we should manage and regulate and control our conversational efforts when we become capable of having them. I don't want Elon Musk being the first human to have a conversation with elephants, right? Because he can afford it, right? The first thing, I don't want Elon Musk to be the first human elephants have a chat with. And that's just a way of, but of course, I don't want me to be the first humans they have a chat with, where the only ethical constraints I've got are the ones I thought up myself. Right? We need to think very carefully about how we should go about this. Right now, Jimmy, let me just add that right now, already we can address elephants by their name in elephant. I'll be right there with you. We can address using synthesizers because we figured out because the computers can tell the difference between a mother talking to babies and two adults talking, as I mentioned. We can figure out elephant names because, of course, a mother talking to offspring uses the offspring's name all the time, just like human mothers do, right? Right? Johnny, eat your oatmeal, right? Johnny, right? You didn't flush the toilet. Johnny, right? We don't do that with adults. Don't do that, right? So, and similarly, we can see that the elephant mothers have this every time the baby's wandering away. The mother says this thing, and the baby comes. So they were able to figure out. So we know elephant names now. That's been figured out from rumbles. You can feed the rumbles into the AI, and the AI will tell you this elephant's name in elephant is. You can't make the sound, right? Our larynxes, we don't have trunks, and our larynxes are wrong shape. But the synthesizer can emit the elephant's name, and of course, people have done this, right? They get elephants, and they emit the elephant. They say basically hello to the elephant through a synthesizer. The elephants so far who have been exposed to that don't like it. They're frightened. They're quite frightened. Right? I mean, they can see it's a very weird thing. Nothing like that's ever happened to them. Yeah. And they can also tell because of their olfactory acuteness. They know it wasn't another living creature that just pronounced their name. It was a non-living thing, something like a rock. Like a rock talked to them. So we got to be careful. And sorry, I cut you off.
My apologies to you. I was just thinking about Douglas Adams and the dolphins. So long and thanks for all the fish.
Right, yeah.
Douglas Adams.
Yeah, Douglas Adams had it right, that's right. Dolphins first.
Okay, well, I think we could talk all night. We're going to have a little more, but thank you so much, Ron. What a wonderful conversation. And we're all going to survive the end of civilization. Be here for your next book.
Thank you, Caleb.
And Don will be signing here, if you don't mind staying here. The book is $3.50. We'd love you to buy it. Thank you.
Can I get a glass of wine and then come back?
I'll bring you a glass of wine, yes.
Yeah. White, please.